Good afternoon, Charleston Literary Festival. Welcome to this afternoon's session featuring Bill McKibben in conversation with Leilani Brown. Before we kick off the session, I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsors of this session, the Southern Environmental Law Centre, and Kathleen Paramore and Tom Taft. And now, to formally introduce this session, I would like to welcome Elise Campaign, SELC's Climate Initiative Leader. Elise Campaign.
Thank you all for being here to welcome Bill McKibben and Leilani Brown to bring their sunshine to this remarkable festival. First, a friendly reminder to please silence your cell phones. And now on to our lovely speakers. I've worked with and around Bill since 1993, which was a few years after his bold book, The End of Nature, had been published. It was the first major book about climate change that was written for a general audience. And he was one of the first people to really grasp and convey that the enormity of the climate emergency requires solutions-oriented movement building. Too often, climate and energy debate becomes overly complex, bureaucratic, and technical. But Bill really flipped that script. He's like the Marie Kondo of the climate advocacy movement. Keep it simple, get rid of the clutter, and find the joy. One of my favorite lines of his is, the technology we need most badly is the technology of community and the knowledge about how to cooperate to get things done. In addition to writing 20 books, many articles, he's a distinguished scholar in environmental studies at Middlebury College, has won many prizes and honorary degrees, and has founded two bold grassroots movements, 350.org, and more recently, Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 in pursuit of climate and justice advocacy. I'm quite jealous that among his many distinctions, Bill was honored by California biologists who named a new species of fungus gnat in his honor. Our session interlocutor, Leilani Brown, is an author and founder of Giant Steps, a consulting firm that specializes in strategy, culture, career, and education. And this talk comes at a critical time, a time when optimism and hope feel fragile and fleeting. And we need to be reminded that climate solutions are right within our grasp. At the Southern Environmental Law Center, we could not agree more, because for nearly 40 years, we've been fighting to help the sunny South take advantage of this remarkable free fuel. And we have made tremendous progress. Many of you may be surprised to know that the South is a solar industry leader. And in fact, in 2023, our region outproduced the national average of the amount of solar power on the grid. South Carolina is also a big part of the solar supply chain, bringing good jobs and driving lower bills. We employ over 3,400 people in the solar industry. We're home to 81 different solar companies and a $4 billion investment in the state. SELC is committed to driving momentum forward and overcoming the barriers that are in our way. Whether in court or in our communities, we are confident that these obstacles can and will be overcome, but it takes all of us to make that happen. The beauty and liberation that are the core of Bill's book are going to help us get there. And with that, I bring you Bill McKibben and Leilani Brown. Thank you.
Good afternoon. And Bill, welcome to Charleston.
What a pleasure to be in Charleston, and it was kind of you to have some Vermont weather for Sue and I to feel right at home. Yes.
Yes, we will send you and it on your way. So I want to dive right in. You've written so many books. You're such an important figure in environmental work and impact. But I want to start and focus with the book, which is so wonderfully named. It's melodic. and it's urgent and it's also hopeful. Here comes the sun, a last chance for the climate and a fresh chance for civilization. So my first question to you is, why this book and why now?
Well, it's a good question, because it's the sad fact of my life is that I've spent most of it as a professional bummer-outer of other people. I wrote the first book about what we now call the climate crisis, what we then called the greenhouse effect back in the 1980s. And sadly, all the things that we said were going to happen are now happening on this planet, which is a much warmer place and beginning to break apart under the power of that added warmth. Just in the last 10 days, we were talking this morning, we've seen Hurricane Melissa hit Jamaica with the highest wind speeds we've ever recorded on this planet, 252 miles an hour at 600 feet above sea level, the kind of speed you can only get when you have a superheated ocean providing fuel. That same day, we saw in Vietnam the biggest rainstorm that we've ever recorded. In 24 hours, 5 feet of rain fell across that part of the world. And amidst the travails of climate change, in our country, I think, in my opinion, we're going through a difficult political period unlike any I've ever seen, where it feels some days as if our democracy is flickering and faltering. In the face of that, I suppose it would have been easy to write another depressing book. There's perfectly good justification for that. But there is also one big good thing happening on this earth right now. And it's big enough and good enough that it presents some challenge both to the climate crisis and to the authoritarianism crisis. And that is this rapid rise of clean energy. You and I have been calling this stuff our whole lives alternative energy, okay? Sun, wind, the batteries to store them when the sun goes down or the wind drops. They're no longer alternative. They're the common sense, straightforward, obvious way to make power on this earth. 90%, almost 95% of new electric generation around the planet last year came from sun and wind and batteries, okay? In this country, it was over 90%. This is all brand new. I mean, in some ways, this book is sort of fresh reporting on stuff that people hadn't quite focused on because it's happening so quickly. It's really a story of the last 36 months. It took us from 1954, when the first solar cell was invented in New Jersey, until 2022 to install the first terawatt of solar power on this planet. The second terawatt came between 2022 and 2024. The third will pass sometime in the next month or so. The planet is generating a third more energy from the sun this fall than we were last fall. There are places around the world where you can see this and just be blown away by it. China, where it's centered, the Chinese in May were putting up 3 gigawatts of solar panels a day. A gigawatt's the equivalent of a large coal-fired power plant. They were building one of those out of solar panels every 8 hours, okay? Those kind of numbers are not enough to stop global warming. We're not going to stop global warming at this late date. But they are enough. If we were able to push it everywhere on the planet and accelerate it continuously, where we would begin to shave tenths of a degree off how hot the planet gets. This is the first scalable tool we've had to take on climate change in the 40 years I've been working on it. And shaving tenths of a degree, that matters. Every 1/10 of a degree that we raise the temperature of the Earth moves another 100 million human beings out of a safe climate zone and into a dangerous one. So this is incredibly important work. It's also incredibly important work because, and this is the reason for this sudden explosion above all, this is now the cheapest form of power in the world. If you're interested in affordability, which all of a sudden all politicians are very interested in, if you're interested in abundance, if you're interested in any of these things, this is the fascinating, fascinating story of the moment, and one that might begin to start undercutting and subverting some of the grotesque inequalities in wealth and power that we see on this planet.
I mean, you just covered most of the book. I'm going to try to pick a few pieces.
Yes.
I will want to go back to hurricanes and natural disasters
Yes,
and things
yes.
like that. But I do want to segue to the idea of affordability and how accessible it is.
Yeah.
So sun and wind are the cheapest forms of energy production, but nobody knows that.
Yeah. Well, nobody in this country knows it, and that's because, among other things, if you want to put it on your house in America, it costs 3 times what it would in the EU or Australia or someplace, because we have way too much bureaucracy, especially at the state and local level. Every place else in the world, if you want solar panels on your roof, you call up somebody on Monday morning, and by Friday afternoon, you're hooked up and pumping power out. This is not complicated technology, and it shouldn't be much more difficult than getting a new refrigerator or something. That's what it's like in most of the world, and here's what happens when it is like that. Australia, where it's cheap and easy, almost 40% of households now have solar panels on the roof. There's also big solar farms of the kind that the current administration is doing everything that it can to block in this country. They have so much solar energy now in that country that the Australian government last Monday announced that beginning in 2026, all Australians would get 3 free hours of electricity every afternoon. And you could use that, you could set the timer for your washing machine and your dishwasher. You could charge your EV during that stretch. You could go buy a battery, which are now quite cheap, and fill it with all the electricity you wanted all afternoon, and then you'd have free electricity all night. That's what affordability and abundance look like in practice, and there's absolutely no reason that we couldn't be having that here too. South Carolina is blessed with sunshine, and as I could tell today, blessed with wind too. And these two things together provide the possibility for literally infinite amounts of very, very cheap energy. This is the revolution that's going on across the rest of the planet. It's going on across parts of this country too. California is now producing so much renewable energy, mostly from the sun, that for almost every day, for long stretches of the day, 100% of their power comes from renewable energy. At night, when the sun goes down, batteries are the biggest source of supply now on the grid that had been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon. California is using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity than they were 2 years ago. That's in the 4th largest economy in the world. It might be worth asking some of your state energy regulators why they've decided now would be a good time to build a huge gas-fired power plant in South Carolina. I have the bad feeling you may be about to get stuck with technology that's already on the verge of anachronistic and that will be highly obsolete 40 years from now when that thing is or is not paid off, you know. The rest of the world isn't doing that. The rest of the world is figuring out how to do this with sun and wind. And when I say the rest of the world, I include parts of this country. You know what state is the biggest builder of renewable energy now, having surpassed California last year? It's the state of Texas. Headquarters of the world hydrocarbon industry, but also a place that takes free market economics seriously and has figured out that this is the cheap way to keep the lights on.
Bill, you were earlier. You were in conversation with the Marsh Project, talking about that very project around the Edisto. I heard a little whistle. It's okay. Where's the Marsh Project?
The Marsh Project guys were fantastic. It was really fun to see the next generation of environmentalism in this part of the world.
Absolutely, but I think it's not. Knowing about that project is not something that everyday people are thinking about. Certainly there's an opportunity to engage and work as an advocate. What are some of the things that we can do just as everyday people engaging in it? So you mentioned a holy trinity of electronic items that we might have, and so they were an electric vehicle or an electric bike or maybe a golf cart down here in South Carolina. Or what are some of the things that we would have?
So if the kind of trinity of energy supply is sun and wind and batteries, then for electricity consumption, the key things are the EV, the heat pump to replace the furnace, and in the kitchen, the induction cooktop, which you can get for $60 on Amazon if you insist on shopping at Amazon, to replace the open flame in your kitchen. These are all better than the things that they replace. I'm mostly the cook in our family, and I can tell you that you can boil water twice as fast on your induction cooktop as you can on your gas flame. And by the way, the chances that your kid or grandkid will develop asthma go down by half when you no longer have an open campfire in your kitchen. The heat pump is an elegant replacement for the furnace. It both heats and cools using the ambient heat in the air outside. The EV is a far more elegant vehicle than you've ever driven in the past. If you like to go fast, it goes very fast, very quickly. If you don't like to spend a lot of time at the mechanic, it has almost no moving parts. There's really almost nothing to break down. But good as the EV is, I think that the e-bike, which my wife is a real expert on, may turn out to be the single greatest invention of all of these. They're spreading by the hundreds of millions every year now around the developing world. A bicycle was good, elegant technology to begin with. Now we've invented a bicycle without hills, okay? And it runs 5 miles on a penny's worth of electricity. You can generate that electricity from the solar panel on a roof. That's really as close to, powered by angels as we are going to get. And it's remarkable to see these things spreading. It gives one, in a dark time, some hope about the possibilities of what our kids might be left with if we do the job. But one very big caveat, we got to do this fast. Climate change is a timed test, okay? It's not like our other political issues where we just argue them back and forth over and over and over again, make a little progress, a little regress, back and forth. No, this one is different. Once we've melted the Arctic, it's not like someone has a good plan for freezing it back up again. This is a series of one-way ratchets which we are going past. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us that if we wanted to be on anything like the timetable we set in Paris just a decade ago, we'd need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is now 4 years and 3 months away. That doesn't give us much time at all, but it's why it's good news, that number I gave you from California, say, where natural gas is down 40% for electricity in 2 years. These things are not beyond the realm of the possible, but we have to get to work and push hard.
Yeah. Are emissions lowering?
It looks like emissions around the world are almost plateauing. There's been as you know, a constant growth in the use of energy, which is to this point meant fossil fuel, as we get more people and they lead more economically consumptive lives. About 100 million human beings enter what we call the consuming class now every year, most of them in Asia, and they use more and more and more energy. The hotter the world gets, the more people need to survive, an air conditioner, for instance. But we've now put up in the last couple of years enough renewable energy that it looks like we're right at the edge in a lot of places of that plateau. Some places we're going down, like California. China emissions went down in the first half of this year for the first time ever. Which is a remarkable thing because the Chinese economy is still expanding fast. They're a developing country. In the US, sadly, but predictably, given the politics of the moment, emissions rose in the first half of this year. So I hope I never hear another American politician say, no, we don't want to do anything here because what does it matter? China just generates all these emissions. That is an old and tired talking point in this world. China is, forget about petrostates for the moment, China is the world's first electrostate. And its emergence is incredibly interesting. Its emergence is also, frankly, should be for Americans in some ways incredibly disturbing. We invented all this technology. The first solar cell comes out of Bell Labs in Edison, New Jersey in 1954. There are few people in this room, perhaps, who were around in the 1950s dropping dimes in payphones. You helped pay for the first solar cell, okay? First in commercial wind turbine in the world was in Vermont, where I live, in 1943. We've just handed all this stuff to China. When world historians write about the last 9 months, the story they will tell is of a country voluntarily ceding the economic and technological future to what is theoretically its main adversary. And that should be a painful story, I think, for Americans to think about. I don't know exactly how it will end, and I assume that at some point we'll resume sort of trying to catch up, but man, we've ceded a lot of ground very fast.
Yeah, I love the way you talk about this globally and also locally. I want to also address something that you wrote about, which is sort of the lopsided impact and lopsided emissions. And so I think the number, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of 43% coming out of the United States, but the disproportionate negative impact to the continent of Africa.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Yep.
3% of they contribute 3% to the emissions, but disproportionately are impacted by emission use.
Leilani, I was thinking about this a couple of years ago. Sue and I live in Vermont, and we had the worst flooding we've ever had in Vermont. I mean, it was a true disaster, and the kind you can only have on a world where warmer air holds more water vapor than cold, and we're capable of having rainstorms like we've never seen before. Every highway superintendent in Vermont has spent the last decade ripping out 12 and 14-inch culverts and putting in 18-inch culverts because the old book no longer works for the new world. So we'd had this terrible spate of flooding, and I was very attuned to it. We lost a house right near ours. Right about the time that rain stopped, it started raining in North Africa, and they had the biggest rains that they had ever had. In Libya, this big river started swelling. wiped out a couple of big dams, rushed into a coastal city, and in the course of an hour swept 10,000 people out to sea where they drowned. Okay? Not that anybody paid much attention, because there aren't a lot of cameras, keeping track of what's happening in Libya these days. But it was the kind of thing that now happens across the poor parts of the world with astonishing regularity. And you're absolutely right. America's put about a quarter of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are there, and they're all still there. I mean, all the stuff that came out of the back of my family's Plymouth Fury in the 1970s when I was getting my learner's permit, it's all still up in the air, trapping heat, The entire continent of Africa, Libya, every other country in Africa, has put about 3% of all the greenhouse gases in the air. This is not their fault, but it's their problem. The good news is, to the extent that there can be good news, is that finally, and this year seems to be the moment, lots of Africa is starting to get electricity for the first time from solar panels. There are 600 to 700 million people in Africa with no electricity. The fossil fuel industry has done nothing for them. 250 years of burning coal might as well not have happened, except to raise the temperature of the earth, because they never got electricity out of it. But now they are. Along those Chinese trade routes, solar panels, cheap solar panels, are now flowing, and villages are putting up microgrids and getting electricity for the first time. Not just Africa. I tell the story in the book of what happened in Pakistan in the last 18 months or so. Beginning about January of 2024, energy analysts were kind of startled to see the demand for electricity on the grid in Pakistan beginning to drop quite sharply. Nobody could figure out what was going on, because, as I said, humans always use more energy. When they started looking closer, one of the things they did was look at Google Earth, and you could watch across the rooftops of Karachi and Lahore and Islamabad as week after week solar panels just spread everywhere. It wasn't a government program. It was individual Pakistanis fed up with expensive and unreliable electricity, getting their hands on cheap Chinese solar panels, and then going on TikTok and YouTube and learning how to snap them together. Pakistan had 5 years ago a national electric grid of 43 gigawatts. Individual Pakistanis have put up something like 40 gigawatts in the last 5 years on the roofs of their homes, factories, malls. It's an amazing story of kind of do-it-yourself energy democracy, and one that hopefully will be emulated more and more places. It is what's starting to happen now in Africa.
Yeah, necessity is becoming the mother of invention in that way.
That's exactly right.
So we have a gold rush going on in our world, which is AI. And this race to the best solution and constant usage, and hey, ChatGPT, can you plan my trip to Kenya? But that has some environmental costs as well. What can you talk about what those are, and,
Sure.
and what the impact is, and what some possible solutions are?
Sure. The first thing I'll say is, I don't think it's completely clear yet. It is a gold rush. It's not clear that there's much gold at the end of the rush yet. So far, there's a lot of people throwing money into something that isn't generating much in the way of revenue, perhaps because a lot of the chat GPTs of the world turn out not to be all that good at, but I'd be careful about your trip to Kenya that they're planning.
I had to fact
make
check
sure that it, But yes, let's assume for the moment that we desperately need to build data centers very fast to keep up with the Chinese somehow in this endeavor. By the way, the Chinese don't seem to be racing us quite as hard here, and to the extent that they are, the thing that they're doing is putting up lots and lots of solar farms to power them, because that's the easiest, quickest, cheapest way to provide power. Unless you're willing to provide super, super dirty and expensive power. That's what Elon Musk has been doing in Memphis. He went and rented a bunch of very dirty turbines, and I think that SELC may have been involved in some of the litigation to try and slow that down some, because he, of course, installed them in a poor community of color where they're running around the clock. But in the real world, the easiest way to do this is to put up a quick solar farm and supply the power for a data center. The second easiest way, and this is a really interesting study that came out a couple of weeks ago, where they modeled what would happen in a place like South Carolina that felt the need to have all this new electricity for data centers, okay? What would be the cheapest way to do it? It turns out that the cheapest and fastest way to do it after putting up solar farms would be for a company like Microsoft that wants to build a data center to go around the state, find all the people who are using electric resistance heating, very inefficient old electric baseboard heating, and just hand those people a heat pump, okay? Give it to them to install. At which point they'd be using so much less electricity that they would free up more than the amount the data center requires. It wouldn't cost Microsoft any more. And for the people who got these things, they'd be suddenly not having to toss all their money at Dominion Energy. They'd be getting a much more affordable heating and cooling than they get now. So if we were clever, we could figure out some easy ways to make things like data centers help build a kind of useful, sustainable, renewable, clean, affordable grid, instead of just doing whatever the existing utilities want, which is basically to perpetuate their business model, current business model ad infinitum.
Yeah. You work with two groups of people, sometimes together, sometimes distinctly. You teach at Middlebury College, my alma mater, and you're working with the next generation of leaders and activists. And also you have developed a new organization focused on those who are 60 and over. I'm particularly curious about why 60 and over.
Sure.
What's the magic in 60 and over? I know
Sure.
it gets greater later, but what do you
good.
posit as the merits of being focused on that population around climate change?
Sure. Well, let me say, the reason that we started Third Act, in a sense, was because I'd spent all my life working with young people. I started 350.org with 7 undergraduates at Middlebury, and it became the first big global grassroots climate campaign. And then it spawned all sorts of other wonderful work. We did all this big work on fossil fuel divestment. That was mostly done on campuses. The kids who did that work on 500 colleges across America graduated, wanted to keep working, started the Sunrise movement that brought us the Green New Deal, which eventually became, in much reduced form, Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Other young people around the world were doing fantastic work. I got to know and to really, really like and admire Greta Thunberg, and to know that there were hundreds of Gretas all across the world who were mobilizing millions of kids, 10 million young people in 2019 out in the streets as part of that climate strike work. So good and so powerful, and the only problem was I heard a few too many people my age say, oh, it's up to the next generation to solve this problem, which is A, immoral, and B, highly impractical. As full of intelligence, ambition, and energy as young people are, they lack the structural power by themselves to make the changes we need in the short time that we have. So we started casting about for who does have that kind of power. And I guess I eventually concluded that if you have reached the age where you have hair coming out your ears, then you have structural power coming out your ears too, okay? There are 70 million Americans over the age of 60 in this country. We punch above our weight because every single person in this auditorium who meets that demographic definition, every one of them voted in the last election, okay? There is no known way to stop old people from voting, okay? And we have lots of connections and skills built up over a lifetime, and we have lots of time. So we started this thing, Third Act, to defend climate and democracy, because we thought those were the two things most at risk. And in 3 years, it has grown to 100,000 people across the country with great working groups in most states, really powerful work being done. We hope that you'll join in if you fit that. And we're, if you're 58, I mean, we don't really check ID, so you're welcome to join in. But it's been enormously successful, I think, Leilani, because kids have one set of reasons for being worried about all this. They're going to have to live their whole life in this world that we're building, and that's scary. But we're now, at a certain age, legacy becomes less of an abstract idea than it once was, once you get a little nearer the exit than the entrance. And our legacy at the moment is going to be, we left the world a much worse place than we found it, at least in physical terms. Mm-hmm. So we have some work to do, and we can do, and we are doing. We've been very happy in recent weeks because people kept noting, even including the president, that an outsized share of the people at those No King's Day protests were of a certain age. In fact, Stephen Miller, the president's sidekick there, was giving a tour of Washington, D.C. to reporters, and pointing out all the wonderful troops that he had sent to patrol our nation's capital, and on and on and on. And he was talking about how great it was all going, except, he said, these elderly hippies keep coming out and yelling at us, and they should go home, he said, and take a nap. And at least at Third Act, our response is we are not planning to go to sleep. We are planning to do what we can in the time that we have to make the difference that we can. And one of the things that's really wonderful about that for us has been the fact of getting to back up young people. The very first demonstration we did at Third Act was because a group of high school kids from this group, Fridays for the Future, that's kind of the offshoot of Greta's movement in this country, they had called up and they said, we want to take on the big banks that are financing the fossil fuel industry. Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citi. Those are the four biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry in the world, even though scientists have clearly said, stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure. Well, these kids said, we want to take on these banks, but we don't have checking accounts or credit cards or anything. Can you help? And I was like, we could help. If there's one thing we have, it's credit cards. So the very first demonstration we had was in Boston. And I got there, and there's 400 or 500 high school kids. High school kids definitely understand the barrel of the gun down which they are staring. They were also somewhat sprier, so they were at the head of the march. And at the back of the march, there were a bunch of us from this nascent Third Act group, because we were just still forming, but we had a big banner that just said, fossils against fossil fuels. And all the kids who saw it were like laughing and, high-fiving, but they were also coming up and saying, thank you. The climate anxiety and climate despair that you hear kids, maybe your grandkids, talking about sometimes, I think stems much less from the fact of climate change than from the sense that they have been abandoned to deal with it on their own. And to start backing them up is the right thing to do at this point. So it's a lot of fun in that way.
I'm thrilled you're working with both. I'm not going to hog all the time. I'm going to ask you one question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. But you end the book by holding up what's hard and damaged alongside hope. You are also a Sunday school teacher, and so you teach in a very principled way. What would you like people to walk away with?
Sure.
From this conversation?
I don't get to teach Sunday school often much anymore because I'm off traveling. So you will have to be my Sunday school for today. Look, we can talk, and we have talked about the practical necessity in climate terms of doing this, and about the economic utilitarianism of doing it. This is the cheapest, most obvious way forward. But there's also, I think, some very deep arguments here. And they have to do, maybe they fit under the kind of broad category of sort of beauty. I mean, I obviously stole the title of this book from George Harrison. If you go to Spotify, it turns out that Here Comes the Sun is by far the most streamed song in the Beatles' vast catalog. Twice as many human beings a day listen to it as Hey Jude or Let It Be or anything else, which is interesting. I think that's because it's a beautiful and optimistic, gentle song in a dark time. But I also think it's because humans have a deep, deep connection to the sun. We were talking about this backstage. You can make and we did this thing called Sunday in September, where we had 500 events around the country, rallies and demonstrations about renewable energy. We made a playlist, and it was hundreds of songs long. Every single musician you can think of has written a great song about the sun. In passing, I will note that the playlist of great songs about fracking is shorter than this. Okay.
That's hard to believe.
Yeah. It's the most charismatic object in our corner of the universe, the sun. We don't know exactly how prehistoric people thought about these things, because being prehistoric, they failed to write them down. But we do know that all the piles of stones they left behind, there are thousands of things like Stonehenge, all somehow managed to point at the solstice or the equinox, okay? We know that the minute that people started having kind of mythological systems, the first job for mythologists was to explain how this thing rose over here, set over here, and got back over here the next morning. And so there were an endless array of gorgeous stories about giant turtles and emus who swallow the sun and vomit it up the next morning, and on and on and on. And those have just kept getting deeper and more beautiful over time. I was just in Rome because the new Pope had summoned over a bunch of people to talk about, it was the 10th anniversary of Pope Francis's really beautiful encyclical Laudato Si on climate change. And it was beautiful to be there. The new guy, Leo, who, trust me, you would all immediately recognize as a kind of Midwestern American of our vintage, okay? Weirdly normal human being. He made it very clear that he was sticking the course that Francis had set, that this was crucial for dealing with poverty in the world and so on and so forth. And he said that by early next year, the Vatican would be the first fully solar nation on Earth. They have a big solar farm that they're building outside Rome, and they're going to flip the switch sometime early next year. So this was fantastic. And though I'm a Methodist, I was very impressed with the whole operation. And I said, the slogan for all this work, for all of us, has to be going forward, energy from heaven, not from hell. Okay? so that's the, and if you all can't make that work in this city of churches, then something's wrong,
Ladies and gentlemen, Bill McKibben. We have such a gift here, and we have time for questions. So I can't see that well, but we have one right there. Thank you.
Hi there. Thanks so much for this fantastic talk, Bill. I wanted to ask you a question about cows, actually. I came across a YouTube video, a channel called Roots So Deep You Can See the Devil Down There, and it's about trying to recapture some of the carbon in the soil because it was all stripped out of the Great Plains in the 1920s, etc. And I was thinking about solar panels being put on farmland specifically. And I just wanted to get your thoughts about if it was possible for regenerational grazing and those sort of practices, if it was possible for solar farms to be compatible with that sort of thing, where we are trying to restore the soil, restore carbon in the soil and the environment, but obviously we'd need places to put these solar panels.
Yeah. It's a very good question about sort of solar panels and taking up space. Okay, let's start there. So, by most accounts, it'll take 1.5% or 2% of the American landscape and the landscape of most countries to produce this crop of electrons between solar panels and wind turbines and so on. And then offshore too, where you all have a great resource here. So that means, yes, it will take some land. So let's talk about how we use land in America currently, okay? Our biggest crop in this country is corn. We grow 60 million acres of it. So 30 million acres of that corn are used for ethanol. They're already growing gasoline, okay? But not that much. That 30 million acres produces about 3% of all the energy that America uses. So to give you an example of how solar panels, how efficient they are, if you covered that same 30 million acres with solar panels, you'd produce pretty much 100% of the energy that America now uses, not 3%, okay? We don't want to do it that way because, you don't want to just carpet Iowa in solar panels. And there's lots of rooftops and parking lots and places where it makes sense. But we should use some of that land and not worry about it for a couple of reasons. One is that great efficiency. I was telling people this morning this story. I was at an Illinois farm summer before last where the landowner was putting some of his corn fields into solar panels. He was saying, look, here's an acre where I'm still growing corn and we use it for ethanol. It produces enough ethanol each year to drive my Ford F-150 25,000 miles. So not nothing. But here next to it is an acre that we've converted to solar panels. That produces enough electrons each year to drive my Ford F-150 Lightning, EV version of exactly the same truck. Not 25,000 miles, but 700,000 miles, okay? That gives you some sense of the difference. Then he said, also, and this goes to your point about land use and soil, also, these solar panels, as opposed to my corn stalks, don't require that I pour a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus on them each year in order to make them work. I can just leave the land alone. And that nitrogen and phosphorus doesn't wash down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico. And create a large dead zone, and I don't have to pour on herbicides and pesticides. to make it work. In fact, I have half my field left over. Now, we were talking about this morning with the Marsh crew and saying we need a better word for this than the one we've got now. The word we're using to describe this whole new field of human endeavor is agrovoltaics, which is a clunky way of saying growing things on the half of the field that isn't covered by the solar panels, but where there is suddenly this abundance of shade, a useful thing on an overheating planet, in part because it retains a lot of moisture. So for instance, China, which has had an extraordinary problem with expanding deserts and these enormous dust storms that blow into the cities of the north, Beijing and elsewhere, has for the first time been able to start bringing that under control because these solar farms are retaining so much moisture that the desert is regrowing some of that biotic crust that's easily disturbed but is the thing that holds the sand in place. In Vermont, where Sue and I live, what they're doing increasingly is interplanting the solar panels with pollinator-friendly weeds and flowers. You only have to mow them once a year, and in the rest of the year, they're attracting enormous quantities of the wasps and flies and things that are instantly killed off in any cornfield in the world by those pesticides. We have 100 times the number of pollinating insects in those solar farms as in the cornfields that they replaced, which means that all the surrounding farmers are in seventh heaven. Their apple orchards and things are seeing fruit set go through the roof because now there's lots of buzzing insects to do that work, and we're taking some small hit out of the biodiversity crisis as well as the climate crisis. You know that plummeting numbers of insects are one of the things that have biologists truly terrified on this earth. So there are lots of creative ways to think about farmland. And we have not done a very, let's be honest, very creative way for the most part of thinking about agriculture. We've had as a monoculture and farming system as we have an energy system, We've just done the easiest, cheapest thing over and over and over again. But now we have a chance to take a step back and start doing this in some different ways. And among other things, again, it's really fun to watch young people start to grapple with this and come up with lots of new and exciting things to do. So it's one of the places where I'm quite hopeful.
Great.
Thank you. I hope this is working. Yeah, thank you for your comments about generation of energy, which sounds obviously very optimistic. I'd love to hear your thoughts about beyond sort of the on-site consumption. What are both the challenges and the opportunities of the delivery of the generation of solar power, specifically in this country?
You mean like around transmission?
Right, exactly.
Things.
Transmission, getting that energy out to an existing grid or a new grid in a way that can be efficient and can be economically competitive.
Yep, absolutely. We need to build new transmission, and this was one of the things that the IRA money was focused on doing. And what in fact, the last White House was deeply focused on doing. They had teams of people assigned to each of the big transmission projects in the country doing their best to figure out how to get through all the regulatory loopholes and so on, which are real and profound. Now, of course, we've reversed that work. We're putting the kibosh not only on wind farms off the coast of New England and vast solar farms, but we're also making it almost impossible to build new transmission just because, I don't mean to sound too cynical here, but the President of the United States last year running for office told fossil fuel executives, if you give me $1 billion, you can have anything you want. They gave him $500 million. That proved to be enough. He's running every possible errand for them at the moment, including that. So we're having to do lots of workarounds. Some of them are really technological. People have come up with ways that you can almost double the transmission capacity of existing lines just by using different kinds of line along those things. That kind of work's going to need to continue in the interim. And people are also coming up with what are slightly Rube Goldberg kind of workarounds, but necessary in context. There was a brilliant new study that came out a couple of days ago about how, and now in the first place we're actually doing this in practice is Colorado, how we're using what they're calling transmission in order to get around some of these problems. What they're doing is, in the afternoon, a big train car, long train full of cars that have batteries on them, train cars that have batteries on them, is going to the southwest next to a solar farm or a wind turbine, sucking up clean energy, cheap energy all afternoon, and then hightailing it for Denver, where those batteries are then plugged into the grid. Now, this is not as efficient as building the transmission line would be, but if you can't get the transmission line built, then it's cheaper than the alternatives and makes much more sense environmentally. So we're trying to figure out how to work our way around this. The real answer to this question is we need logical, common sense leadership at every level of government in order to do what now pretty much every other country in the world is now doing. It's not like we're having this same debate in the other 193 countries on the planet. They're mostly figuring out how to get ahead of this stuff. And so that's both the bad news for us and the good news for the planet. And it is good news for the planet. Climate change in the end, I mean, we call it global warming for a reason. It's the sum total of everything's happening. And it's bad that we're out of the heart of the game for the moment, but hopefully we will get back in. That's the reason we do things like Sunday and Third Act and things, is to push us in that direction.
I think we have time for one more. I'm sorry. How do I pick? I'm not going to pick. Y'all pick.
Somebody has a microphone out there.
Oh, look, we got an exuberant right here.
Oh, there's the microphone.
There's the
It's right next to you.
We currently have an autocratic wannabe president who says that climate change is a hoax and tells us that windmills cause cancer. How do we convince people like him and the other fools that are running our country that this is a real problem that really exists?
Well, so it's It's a very good and very sad question in a sense. I wrote The End of Nature in 1989 when George wrote it in 88, published it in 89, when George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, was president of the United States. And we were just getting the first science on climate change from Jim Hansen at NASA. And George H.W. Bush responded the way that you would expect any. He said, this is a big problem. He said, and it was a good line, we're going to fight the White House effect with the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect with the White House effect, okay? So it's a good line. The sad tragedy of our history in this issue is that the fossil fuel industry, we now know, knew exactly as much as I did about climate change in the late 1980s. We know from whistleblowers and archives and things that they had spent the previous decade studying this question hard. Exxon was the biggest company in the world. It had great scientists. Its product was carbon. Of course they were going to study it. And what they found was exactly what Jim Hansen, in fact, Exxon's internal scientific predictions of what the temperature would turn out to be in 2020 were more spot on than Jim Hansen's at NASA. And we know now that these companies believed what their scientists were telling them. Exxon started building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was in the offing. They began planning precisely what parts of the Arctic they would lease for drilling once it had melted. Okay? What they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Across this industry, they engaged in an expensive and long-term campaign of deception and denial and disinformation. And it turns out that if you spend an awful lot of money doing this, you can have a real effect. We went from the place where the president was saying we're going to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect, to the point where, yes, the president of the United States was saying global warming is a hoax manufactured by the Chinese, which, yes, if you were sitting next to someone on the bus who was muttering that under their breath, you would get up and find a new seat, you know? But that's what happens. It's one of the reasons why, if we ever get the chance to make some reforms in America, it might be a good idea to think about how much money we let influence our political system in what ways, okay? For the moment, I don't think there's much chance of getting the president himself or the people closest to him to change their beliefs on these things. I think for the moment, it's going to be very hard to do things in Washington. I think that's why there's a special premium in the next upcoming months on doing things in state and local places. And there is much that can be done. You guys have an important fight on your hands with this gas pipeline and gas-fired power plant that's coming. As I say, if you allow it to be, if you manage to block it for a year or 18 months or something, it won't then be built because the economics will have become so obvious. But if you do allow it to be built, you will have the privilege of paying for it for the next 40 years, you know? So it's a huge thing to be focused on. But there are also lots of small things to be focused on. And, you know, there's no reason at all that this city couldn't be filled with those balcony solar panels that the Europeans have put up in such abundance. All you need to do is change the city ordinance, and they'd be popping up all over the place as people figure out how they can save money. This is a potentially beautiful moment in human history. Human beings have been setting stuff on fire, the archaeologists tell us, for at least 700,000 years. And it's mostly been good. We learned to cook food, which is, you know, Charleston is proof of what a good idea that was, you know. We were able to move north and south from the equator. The anthropologists think that standing around the campfire all night for millennia was one of the reasons we developed the social bonds we have as a species. Think of it as a kind of proto-Zoom, you know. But now the cost of setting things on fire is too high. The climate system is being destroyed. 9 million people a year die, 1 death in 5, from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel, those particulates that lodge in young lungs. We have autocrats all over the world, empowered by the fact that they happen to sit on top of those scattered deposits of coal and gas and oil. Think how the geopolitics of the last 100 years would have been different if oil hadn't been valuable in that time. Think of the wars we wouldn't have to fight. So we have, at this exact moment when we happen to be alive, for the first time in 700,000 years, the possibility of being the people who wean our species off fire and turn it instead to that large ball of burning gas that the good Lord was kind enough to hang up there 93 million miles above our heads. What a sin it would be to waste all that energy and to waste this very, very precious moment. So thank you all.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Charleston Literary Festival.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. much for being with us this afternoon. On behalf of Charleston Literary Festival, I'd just like to thank again Bill McKibben and Leilani Brown. Bill will be making his way to the signing lounge at the back of the theatre, so please exit through the back and you can meet him there and have your book signed. Remember, a signed book makes a great gift. So thank you so much for being with us, everybody. Goodbye.